Over a quarter of a century later, he returned to the Department of Justice, reluctantly, as we will see, to serve from 2019 to 2020 as Attorney General for President Donald J. Trump. Mr. Barr's new book, One Damn Thing After Another, Memoirs of an Attorney General.
Here's what Barr said, describing why he returned to government in his memoir. Quote, I would soon make the difficult decision to go back into government, in large part because I saw the way the president's adversaries had enmeshed the Department of Justice in his phony scandal and were using it to hobble his administration. Once in office, it occupied much of my time for the first 6 months of my tenure. It was at the heart of my most controversial decision. Even after dealing with the Mueller Report, I still had to launch U.S. Attorney John Durham's investigation into the genesis of this bogus scandal. At the end of my first year in office, the president was impeached over a harebrained effort involving Rudy Guliani to push back on the Russian collusion canard by digging up an alleged counter-scandal in Ukraine implicating the Clinton campaigner, Vice President Biden, and his son Hunter.
And this book is distinguished in the following sense. I believe it is the only book interview I've done where my wife loved the book as well.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Are we recording this?
Yes, the biggest political scandal of our time.
Here's what I think happened to the United States in the past 8 years.
He is casting his opponents as these, in flowery, horrible terms.
He ended up polarizing the country in a way that brings us close to fascism.
There were multiple systematic efforts to interfere in our election. And that allegation deserves the attention of every American. Thank you. Thank you for being here today.
And in accompanying that, trains Republicans to just hate rule of law.
So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to thank you all. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you all for being here.
And you have to spin up the ball of thread before you can tell the story.
So let's go back. We're going to talk about Bill Barr's interference. And most people think of that in a very limited sense. They think of it in terms of Barr's letter to Congress describing the end of the investigation.
It was just announced. There was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction, and none whatsoever. And it was a complete and total exoneration.
Do you think history is going to say the president's right, that he was exonerated today?
Well, there was no collusion, and that is according to Attorney General William Barr's assessment.
It was 4 pages. It didn't adequately represent the investigation. And then a press conference where he announced there was
no collusion by any Americans in IRA's illegal activities.
And that, that it was over.
In other words, there was no evidence of the Trump campaign collusion with the Russian government's hacking.
But there's a lot more there. Last episode, we did the Mueller Report, and we didn't do what we normally do in these podcasts. We didn't say, this is how this development contributed to Trump training people to hate rule of law. We just laid out what happened in the investigation. I want to frame that because the Mueller investigation happened until the end. It was allowed to proceed as it did. In the background, of course, you've got what Devin Nunes is doing with the Hipsy investigation.
Last night, we got a fairly unique look at just how political that investigation has become. MSNBC acquired a secret recording of House Intel Chairman, Republican Devin Nunes, discussing the Russia probe at a fundraiser.
If Sessions won't unrecuse and Mueller won't clear the president, we're the only one. Which is really the danger. That's why.
What are we supposed to make of this? I mean, Devin Nunes has been criticizing the Mueller probe for a long time. So on one level, this isn't surprising. But still, this is the head of the House Intel Committee seeming to imply that his job is to protect the president from Robert Mueller.
After they finished their report, they threw the rest of the investigation over It was a joint investigation, but it was largely led by Mark Meadows.
We have a witch hunt going on, which is disgraceful. And I have to tell you, I'll take these Republican guys with Mark Meadows and Jim Jordan and Gates and Gibbs and all of them. These are tough, smart guys. They know there was no collusion, it turned out, with Russia. There was collusion, but it was with Hillary Clinton, the DNC.
So you had things like George Papadopoulos doing this utterly ridiculous interview with this expanded investigation where they allowed him, first of all, they never got any of his communications, but they allowed him to tell conspiracy theories.
I testified about this particular issue, among many others, in front of the House Oversight Committee. And during my second encounter with the FBI, they asked me to wear a wire against this mystery man, Joseph Mifsud, who 4 days before, I told them, had information that the Russians possessed Hillary Clinton's emails and that you should look into him. I believe hindsight's 20/20, but at that moment, I could have made a dreadful mistake of actually wearing a wire, given what I know now about this individual, Joseph Mifsud, and given what the world knows. Many reporters have been digging into his past, and his own lawyer has made unambiguous statements about who he is, and that is that this man was no Russian agent. This man was working on behalf of Western intelligence and was actively, probably under the guidance of the FBI itself, when he was interacting with George Papadopoulos.
That then would feed the Durham investigation.
Oh, Durham is the special counsel that I appointed to look into how this got going, how this whole Russiagate narrative got going, and why people did what they did, especially the FBI.
You also have the continued effort to make the dossier stand in for the investigation.
Well, I think it's very sad what they've done with this fake dossier. It was made up, and I understand they paid a tremendous amount of money, and Hillary Clinton always denied it. The Democrats always denied it. And now only because it's going to come out in a court case, they said, yes, they did it, they admitted it, and they're embarrassed by it.
You have Trump increasingly screaming about investigation.
Trump saying the inner workings of the Mueller investigation are a total mess. And that's the first time he's claimed to have knowledge of the inner workings of Mueller's team. It's not clear what he might be referring to. It comes just over a week after he named that loyalist, Matt Whitaker, to oversee the probe right after the election. Now, Trump also says Mueller's prosecutors are, quote, screaming and shouting at people, horribly threatening them to come up with the answers they want.
So you have all of those things continuing. Now, during this period, before he went back to government, especially in 2018, Bill Barr was doing two things. One, he was pickling himself in Fox News propaganda.
Well, as I said, the president isn't far from wrong when he called this a witch hunt. It's very much like a witch hunt, what happened.
So the propaganda that Devin Nunes was creating, the propaganda around the dossier.
I mean, I'm troubled by what happened before the election.
Right.
But after the election, when the dossier started falling apart, when they found out that the only source for it, this so-called principal subsource, had been under investigation for being a Russian agent, and that he was saying that the stuff that was reported by Steele was not facts, but really just sort of their speculation. They still went ahead pushing on the administration, going after Flynn, and so forth.
He was injecting that full bore into his brain. And in response, he was secretly writing a memo to undercut what he understood Mueller's theory of obstruction to be.
And the Barr memo reads in part, as I understand it, Robert Mueller's theory is premised on a novel and legally insupportable reading of the law. Moreover, in my view, if credited by the Justice Department, it would have grave consequences far beyond the immediate confines of this case and would do lasting damage to the presidency and to the administration of law within the executive branch.
So in 2018, he's already thinking, how can I kill this investigation?
You were watching the President of the United States pinned against a wall, so to speak, by this Russiagate narrative. And you're as an outsider, you're suspicious of it from the get-go. How come?
Because it never made, I had started off in the CIA and It never made sense to me that the Russians would have had to collude or wanted to collude with someone to engage in what is called a hack and dump operation, hack into some emails and then make them public. It's a pretty simple thing, just to embarrass them. They don't need to collude with anyone to do that. It's their stock in trade. And so it just never made any sense that they would, and the stuff that was being thrown out just didn't add up to me. The more I saw, the more it just appeared to be a phony scandal.
A word about Barr. We had this conversation earlier in this series about how it's possible Donald Trump has closer ties to Russia. It's possible that Donald Trump is compromised, but you don't need to get there. All you need to explain Donald Trump's actions is his narcissism, right? Bill Barr is similar. The more I cover Bill Barr's corruption, more and more often I'm like, is there something more here? In that period in 2018, before he went back to government, was somebody going to him and saying, we need you to go kill this investigation?
I gave up a lot to go in to try to help this administration.
Wait a minute, I just better be explicit for listeners. You surrendered what would have been good money.
Millions.
Got it.
And I don't know the answer to that. I think it's still a question in my mind. But like Trump, you only need Trump's narcissism to explain his actions. With Barr, you only need Barr. And by that I mean three aspects of his personality. One is he is an authoritarian Catholic. He allegedly is not a member of Opus Dei, but he might as well be. He's close to Pat Cipollone.
Donald Trump hired Cipollone at the end of 2018, and that was to replace his first White House counsel, Don McGahn. Now, Trump became dissatisfied with McGahn after he tried to prevent the ex-president from committing potential crimes. McGahn went on to cooperate extensively with the special counsel, Robert Mueller's investigation. And so for his next White House counsel, Trump wanted a true loyalist, a soldier. He chose Cipollone, a right-wing Republican conservative Catholic, who was Fox host Laura Ingraham's spiritual mentor before her conversion to Catholicism.
He's close to half the Republicans on the Supreme Court. He's close to Leonard Leo.
There's no limit to what a man can do or where he can go if he doesn't mind who gets the credit. That quote is on a plaque behind the desk of this guy seen palling around with Clarence Thomas here.
You know, Leonard, since you're the number 3 most powerful person in the world.
Right. God help us.
You know all of his famous cronies who have benefited from their friendship with him, but you probably don't recognize his face. By operating in the shadows and avoiding credit, Leonard Leo has become quite possibly the single most powerful private citizen in America.
That group is close to J.D. Vance.
I felt the touch of God.
This is an authoritarian Catholicism that believes what Barr calls progressives are a threat to society.
Among the militant secularists are many so-called progressives. But where is the progress? We are told we are living in a post-Christian era, but what has replaced the Judeo-Christian moral system? The fact is that no secular creed has emerged capable of performing the role of religion.
And the flip side to that is a truly authoritarian view on society.
AG Bill Barr now announcing the federal government will resume capital punishment. First time since 2003, Barr directing prison officials to schedule the executions of 5 death row inmates. This is not common, especially at the federal level.
So that's one thing.
If you want a presidential cover-up, Barr is your guy.
The second thing is he has a history of cover-ups, right?
In 1989, Barr was the head of the Office of Legal Counsel, providing legal advice to the Bush White House. The FBI wanted to know whether it could legally abduct people in foreign countries without asking the host government. Barr wrote a legal opinion saying, in effect, go for it. But when Congress asked to read that opinion, he offered to send them a summary instead, which, as it turned out, left out a lot of important stuff.
Iran-Contra, he made it go away. And he made it go away by setting up Poppy Bush to pardon his way out of a pretty vast conspiracy.
It involved the Reagan administration secretly selling weapons to Iran to fund anti-communism efforts in Nicaragua. As part of that investigation, the independent counsel brought charges against multiple Reagan officials, including former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, for some little things like perjury and lying to Congress. Barr was skeptical of the investigation. In an interview, he said that many of the Iran-Contra defendants had been treated, quote, very unfairly. And he helped convince President Bush to pardon 6 of those defendants. Weinberger actually got his pardon before he even went to trial. Columnist William Safire gave him the nickname the cover-up general. A lot of people don't remember that William Barr, but one guy does, James Brosnahan. He was one of the prosecutors in the Iran-Contra case.
I was surprised that he was confirmed without much discussion about his role in the Iran-Contra cover-up. I've been waiting for him to do the same thing with the Mueller Report.
And then the third thing is, as I said, being brainwashed by Fox News.
And again, buckle up. Wow, huge, massive developments in the biggest scandal in American history.
My God, this is extraordinary.
What did Barack Hussein Obama know, and when did he know it?
That's all you need. You need authoritarian Catholicism.
God help us.
You need this history of believing you could do corrupt things to cover up.
I felt the touch of God.
And you need this fundamental belief that you get from being completely brainwashed by Fox News.
My God.
So he comes in, and according to his memoir, he had 2 goals: to end the investigation and also to start the Durham investigation. And then, as he described in his memoir, Rudy Giuliani changed things.
Rudy always wanted to be Secretary of State, but Trump didn't give him the opportunity because he thought he was low energy because he fell asleep in a meeting and then on a plane ride.
Rudy Giuliani was already engaged with Lev Parnas in, as Barr describes it, a counter-investigation. But it's really a backlash against the Russian investigation. As Lev Parnas describes it, it really grew out of Rudy Giuliani's representation of Donald Trump.
There's a great effort on the part of the Trump administration to turn the tide.
On collusion, they have nothing. They have nothing. It's somebody's version of the truth, not the truth. Truth isn't truth.
Giuliani takes this narrative and turns it into Ukraine.
It wasn't Trump and the Russians that meddled in the 2016 election. It was actually Hillary and the Ukrainians.
It's Ukrainian collusion, which was large, significant, and proven with Hillary Clinton, with the Democratic National Committee.
Mueller shuts down in May of 2019.
I do not believe it is appropriate for me to speak further about the investigation.
They take the next step towards firing Marie Yovanovitch.
How about this? On the eve of the impeachment vote, a new piece in The New Yorker reveals the remarkable admission from President Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, where he says he needed former Ukraine ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, quote, out of the way because she was hindering his push to get dirt on former Vice President Joe Biden.
And for Barr, those things all collapsed.
They were out to get the president.
So most people, when they think about the way that Barr intervened in the Mueller report, they think about the stuff that happened right after it.
I'm having a good day, too. It was called No Collusion, No Obstruction.
They think about the way that Barr convinced people that there was no quote-unquote collusion.
How big a deal is it if they don't find collusion for the president?
Huge. He's cleared.
And he did that in 3 parts, and it's important for this discussion to distinguish the 3 parts. First, in June of 2018, he claims he just randomly submitted this memo to Rod Rosenstein and Steve Engel saying, I think the way Mueller is approaching obstruction is wrong.
William Barr minimized his 2018 memorandum on obstruction of justice. He elaborated a comprehensive and fully theorized vision of the president's constitutional power. He declared without limit or qualification, and I quote, constitutionally, it is wrong to conceive of the president as simply the highest officer in the executive branch. He alone is the executive branch. As such, he is the sole repository of all executive powers conferred by the Constitution. Thus, the full measure of law enforcement authority is placed in the president's hands, and no limit is placed on the kinds of cases subject to his control. That manifesto of an imperial executive has alarming implications for the Mueller investigation and for the whole of the executive branch.
Aaron Zebley and a couple of other Mueller prosecutors just came out with a book, and they described that was remarkably timely because that was literally in the period where they're having exactly that discussion. And DOJ effectively adopted Bill Barr's take on obstruction as these discussions went on.
You know, now with only a few weeks to go before the next presidential election, this look back by Mueller's associates is especially relevant because, as the authors note, the threat of interference by Russia and others hasn't gone away.
What's interesting about the book, and I wrote a post on this, is that Victoria Toensing, who would go on to be a key player in impeachment, in Lev Parnas, in the Ukraine scandal.
We would meet at the BLT Steakhouse restaurant at the Trump International Hotel. There's a private room there that I was told by Don Jr. It was swept once a week to make sure that there was no listening devices there. The BLT team was compiled of Rudy Giuliani, who's the head, then it was me and Igor. And then you had John Solomon, who was the Hill reporter at the time. Then you had Joe DeGeneva and Victoria Toensing, who were two right-wing lawyers that used to work for Trump.
Victoria Toensing is already representing several witnesses, including Sam Clovis, who probably learned about the emails ahead of time, including, importantly, Eric Prince,
the founder of Blackwater, brother of Betsy DeVos,
who met with this Russian oligarch, Kirill Dmitriev, in the Seychelles. Prince claims he deleted his texts and doesn't remember deleting his texts with Steve Bannon about the meeting. And so Victoria Toensing is already in the thick of the Mueller investigation at this time.
This is what the president does. He can hire people and he can fire people. He can hire anybody on his staff and fire them, and he's not to be questioned about that. Or they're covered by executive privilege. The silly question about, well, what were you thinking when you were deciding to fire Michael Flynn? These are improper questions, and I'm embarrassed that anybody practicing law for more than 1 year created these questions for the president.
And then John Dowd, who also would go on to play a role in the Ukrainian scandal.
After the president's Saturday tweet that said, I had to fire General Flynn because he lied to the vice president and the FBI. The president's personal lawyer, John Dowd, stepped in, claiming he was the one who wrote the tweet, not the president. Dowd then yesterday revealed a potential legal defense in the ongoing Russia probe, telling NBC News it's ignorant to say the tweet admitted obstruction. Dowd argued, quote, the president cannot obstruct justice because he is the chief law enforcement officer under the Constitution.
But John Dowd, Trump's private lawyer, quits. And one of the people that's hired to replace John Dowd is Rudy Giuliani. So you've got the two key players in the Ukrainian scandal, Victoria Toensing and Rudy Giuliani.
Fox News has learned the president's private attorney, Rudy Giuliani, was not acting alone in trying to get dirt from Ukrainian officials on 2020 rival Joe Biden. Two high-profile Washington lawyers, Joe DeGeneva, who's been a fierce critic of the Democratic investigation, and his wife, Victoria Toensing, were working with Giuliani to get Oppo research on Biden. According to a top U.S. official, all three were working off the books, apart from the administration. The only person in government who knows what they were doing is President Trump.
Rudy Giuliani, according to the book, first meeting with Mueller's team, Rudy says, you can't charge the president anyway, so why are you conducting this obstruction analysis? And Mueller's team is sort of hedging because they're like, if we figure out this guy is really working for Russia, then we'll find a way to do it.
If there were some extraordinary circumstance, for example, if we had found evidence that Trump was actually like a Manchurian candidate taking orders from Russia, maybe we would have gone back to DOJ to try to get them to revisit that opinion.
But Rudy ran to the press and said they can't charge the president anyway, so we don't have to do an interview. And from that point forward, Mueller was like, Rudy Giuliani is not working in good faith. He's not following the rules of a lawyer.
We tried to only deal with his other lawyers, and were able to avoid dealing with Rudy as much as humanly possible.
It would follow the later Ukrainian caper for Rudy Giuliani and Victoria Toensing to basically be a unit. And in fact, Toensing's spouse, Joe DeGeneva, had claimed to be working for Trump before Rudy got hired.
Victoria Tensing and Joe DeGeneva, the founding partners of the DeGeneva and Tensing law firm. Great to have you both with us. I get half credit, Joe. Come on, I get half credit.
You're doing fine, Lou.
Thank you, sir. Good to see you. Victoria, great to see you.
Victoria Tensing's close to Bill Barr. So in other words, between the Zedley book and Lev Parnas's recent statement that Victoria Tensing got Barr hired.
They were a key part in getting Bill Barr to become Attorney General. Victoria told them, don't worry about it. Bill Barr is going to wipe away the Mueller report, and that was it.
Now, Lev is talking at a later point, meaning after Sessions is fired, Tensing tells Trump that Bill Barr will reliably get rid of the Mueller investigation. But given Tensing's relationship with Barr, Rudy is sharing information he learns from the investigation. Rudy and Tensing are a unit. It would be unsurprising if Tensing told Barr where things were in May of 2018 when Rudy first learned about it, and then Barr in turn wrote that memo.
Early in the investigation, it looked like the president might be willing to meet with us. His lawyers were pushing us to move as fast as we could, and we were trying to move as fast as we could. And his lawyers thought that if Trump came in and met with us, sat for an interview, that could make our investigation end more quickly, and we could at least, we could investigate the rest of it, but the investigation as to Trump could be over. So we actually had a date. We were going to interview him on January 27th at Camp David, but as the winter of 2017 came through, and our investigation on everything else progressed, and we started charging people with crimes. People started cooperating, and their cooperation became public. The president's tune began to change, but ultimately it became clear to us that we were not going to get a voluntary interview of the president.
So the memo tells DOJ how to fight back against Mueller's efforts to subpoena Donald Trump. Successfully. He's never subpoenaed.
Did the president refuse a request to be interviewed by you and your team?
Yes.
Yes. And is it true that you tried for more than a year to secure an interview with the president?
Yes.
And is it true that you and your team advised the president's lawyer that, quote, an interview with the president is vital to our investigation, close quote?
Yes.
And is it true that you also, quote, stated that it is in the interest of the presidency and the public for an interview to take place, close quote?
Yes.
But the president still refused to sit for an interview by you or your team?
True.
This is the famous one. Mueller submits his report on March 22nd, 2019, and Bill Barr sends a letter to Congress saying
there was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction and none whatsoever.
It's very clear from documents that have been FOIA'd since that they had no fucking idea what was in the report when they wrote that. Barr just, he took a couple of quotes out of context, sent them to Congress, and said no collusion. And it led everyone to believe there was no collusion.
Huge. He's cleared.
Barr similarly did the same when the Mueller report was released on April 19th. Same thing. He made a speech.
As you will see, the special counsel's report states that his, quote, investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities.
It was misleading. It ignored bits. It reinforced this notion there was no there.
I agree with that general statement.
So we've got the obstruction memo, we've got the letter to Congress, and then in addition, when he was sending that letter, he and Rosenstein and Steve Engel and Ed O'Callaghan reviewed the obstruction side, volume 2, and they made what amounts to a declination decision.
Barr said specifically that he was disregarding the Justice Department policy that said a sitting president can't be charged with crimes. He said, I'm not paying attention to that.
Mueller had chosen not to come to a conclusion about obstruction. And the Zedley book confirms that one reason they did that, and this is consistent with Watergate, one reason they did that was because it's Congress's job to figure out whether the president did something that needs to be impeached.
If you can't charge him with a crime, so what do you then do? And if you look at the OLC opinion and you look at sort of the reasons for it, they say that it is up to not a single prosecutor to make an accusation of wrongdoing against a sitting president. It's actually up to Congress. It's up to the House to bring impeachment against a president, to bring an accusation of wrongdoing, because the House is an elected body and it's part of the political process.
You can't do anything unless Congress impeaches him. It's Congress's job. I think Mueller fully expected Congress to consider this for impeachment and did not. So they purposely did not make a decision. And Barr was like, oh, well, I have to make a decision.
He said, regardless of that policy, just ignore that policy, regardless of that rule, I, William Barr, have reviewed all of the evidence, and I have determined that no way should Trump face any charges.
And therefore, over the period of 48 hours, they wrote this memo saying none of these 10 incidences of obstruction amount to obstruction. Importantly, they focused on the ones like the June 9th meeting where it couldn't be obstruction. It's in there because Donald Trump, quote unquote, colluded with Vladimir Putin on how to cover up the June 9th meeting.
Halfway through the dinner, Trump gets up, goes around the table, sits down next to Putin, and begins this conversation. Everyone that was there, this was in full view of all of these heads of state and their spouses. And it was very animated. It was extremely friendly. There was certainly a lot of hand motion going on between the two leaders, the two presidents, but no one knows what they were out of earshot. So, I mean, unless the Russian translator has a tape, and I think there's a probably reasonably likelihood that he does, then, nobody else is going to have a readout of this meeting.
That would never amount to criminal obstruction, but it's in Volume 2. And I've argued the reason it is because it is something you can impeach for. Working with Vladimir Putin to cover up a quid pro quo meeting is something that should be impeachable. It's not that far off from what was impeached with Volodymyr Zelensky.
The president's first White House counsel and a copious note-taker, McGahn was cited 157 times in the Mueller report.
They didn't closely address the Don McGahn thing, which Bill Barr had said in his memo could amount to obstruction, that you're basically creating a false document. Remember, he asked Don McGahn, to make a public announcement that he was not being investigated, and that would have been false.
He recounted the president asked him to have Mueller fired on multiple occasions. McGahn says he refused to lie about those conversations later. At the time, the president said he hadn't thought about firing the special counsel.
I haven't given it any thought.
And then super important, because Barr was asked 3 times in his confirmation hearing, if somebody offers a pardon for false testimony, is that obstruction? And Barr said,
no, that would be a crime.
The first 2 times he said, yeah.
Is it permissible for a president to pardon a member of his administration in order to prevent testimony about illegal acts?
Is it permissible under what?
Would it strike you as obstruction of justice for him to exercise his presidential pardon power for the purpose of preventing testimony?
Yeah, I think that if a pardon was a quid pro quo to altering testimony, then that would definitely implicate an obstruction statute.
And the 3rd time he said, well, it could be.
So what if a president told a witness not to cooperate with an investigation or hinted at a pardon?
I'd have to know the specific. Facts.
Okay. And you wrote on page 1 that if a president knowingly destroys or alters evidence, that would be obstruction.
Yes.
Okay. So what if a president drafted a misleading statement to conceal the purpose of a meeting? Would that be obstruction?
Again, I'd have to know the specifics.
That declination memo, which Barr wrote in 48 hours, does not mention the word pardon. Doesn't address pardons. Couldn't address pardons because they were ongoing.
In July of 2019, the Mueller prosecutor, specifically Jeannie Rhee, approached my attorneys just before the release of the Mueller report, seeking my cooperation, essentially in return for some unspecified leniency in sentencing.
Couldn't address pardons because Trump was still at that time trying to guarantee Roger Stone's silence, and did, with a first commutation and then a pardon.
My hat is off to the president.
Barr comes in, writes the letter, writes this memo, and the process of the memo is important to understand. Barr is new to this case. Rosenstein, at least according to his later testimony, really doesn't have as good of a notion of this case as he thinks.
I'm not arguing with you about assigning it to Mueller. I'm saying, was there a legitimate reason to believe that any of the people named in this letter were actively working with the Russians in August 2017?
In August 2017.
That's when you signed the memo.
My understanding, Senator, was that there was.
What is it?
Suspicion.
What was it?
Based in, and now again, Senator, the investigation is concluded, and these people were not conspiring with the Russians. The information available at the time included.
Well, why do we have the Mueller investigation at all if we had concluded they weren't working with the Russians?
I don't believe we had concluded it at that time.
I'm saying in January the 4th, 2017, the FBI had discounted Flynn. There was no evidence that Carter Page worked with the Russians. The dossier was a bunch of garbage. And Papadopoulos is all over the place, not knowing he's being recorded, denying working with the Russians. Nobody's ever been prosecuted for working with the Russians. The point is, the whole concept that the campaign was colluding with the Russians, there was no there in August 2017. Do you agree with that general statement or not?
I agree with that general statement.
Thank you.
So Ed O'Callaghan is the one who's supposed to have some understanding of what's going on.
Ed O'Callaghan, who merged yesterday for the first time publicly as a spokesman for the McCain campaign in Alaska, he's actually a lot more than that.
Stephen Engel, who's in charge of OLC, for some reason has been involved in efforts to prevent Donald Trump from being subpoenaed, as is John Demers, who's the head of National Security Division at DOJ. It's inexplicable why especially John Demers was involved, but he was. The idea is they get the report, and the only one who's read it closely, the only one who's supposed to know it closely is Ed O'Callaghan.
He left the Justice Department at the end of July and was flown to Alaska as part of a McCain campaign rapid response team to deal with the Troopergate investigation.
And in the course of 2 days, they claim, they read the report and write the memo.
Barr used the word collusion.
The special counsel found no collusion. There was no evidence of the Trump campaign collusion with the Russian government's hacking.
But collusion is not a legal term for a crime, as indicated in the Mueller report.
I've said that I think Mueller didn't reach a declination decision on obstruction in Volume 2 because he intended it to be a referral to Congress.
Special Counsel Mueller did not indicate that his purpose was to leave the decision to Congress. I hope that was not his view, since we don't convene grand juries and conduct criminal investigations for that purpose.
The report does not say that Mueller intended to leave the obstruction-related decisions to Barr. Mueller says that Congress, as a general matter, has the power to subject the president to obstruction laws, and his report uses suggestive language about Congress's role in this debate. He didn't want to potentially preempt constitutional processes for addressing presidential misconduct. That's a reference to impeachment, as a footnote makes clear.
And that follows the model used with Watergate, which is to say you don't make a decision about whether something merits criminal prosecution for Congress.
It's actually up to Congress. It's up to the House to bring impeachment against the president, to bring an accusation of wrongdoing.
There's a separation of powers issue there. So that is why, in my opinion, they did not reach a declination. That's one of the reasons they didn't reach a declination decision on Volume 2. And so Barr gets that, and they realize there's no declination decision. And they're panicked because they can't leave this open to Congress.
I would analogize it to this. After a months-long trial, if I wanted to go out and get out to the public what the verdict was, pending preparation of the full transcript, and I'm out there saying, here's the verdict, and the prosecutor comes up and taps me on the shoulder and says, well, the verdict doesn't really fully capture all my work. How about that great, cross-examination I did? Or how about that third day of trial where I did that? This doesn't capture everything. My answer to that is I'm not trying to capture everything. I'm just trying to state the verdict.
They can't leave any question. Barr had come in here strictly to get rid of this prosecution, so they have to very quickly say nothing there.
Barr's letter said, quote, the evidence developed during the special counsel's investigation is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. Our determination was made without regard to and is not based on the constitutional considerations that surround the indictment and criminal prosecution of a sitting president. That's what Barr did. That's what Barr said. Turns out that was a lie. At least a federal appeals court in Washington has just ruled that that was a lie. According to a unanimous ruling from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, a 3-judge panel, when Robert Mueller turned in his report to the Justice Department, Attorney General Bill Barr and the Justice Department never actually considered at all whether or not Trump committed crimes or whether Trump should be charged. They literally never even looked at that possibility, despite what they said they were doing publicly.
And this is what Amy Berman Jackson, when she was dealing with the FOIA for this, kept saying. She's like, you're making it up as you go along because the whole thing is so corrupt.
Judge Amy Berman Jackson also said that some of Bill Barr's Department of Justice representations, quote, are so inconsistent with the evidence in the record, they are not worthy of credence.
So that's what happened with the memo. Over the course of a panicked weekend, they try and solve a problem that Mueller left for him, which is that there is no declination decision, and they quickly make this declination decision with the memo.
That's how Bill Barr broke the neck of the Mueller investigation in 2019.
So Zebley and Goldstein,
key members of the special counsel team that was led by Robert Mueller and that investigated Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election.
Zebley and Goldstein have said their primary complaint with Bill Barr was that he misrepresented their choice not to make a decision, which they left to Congress, which he claimed was their failure to make a decision about obstruction.
Jan Crawford is with us from Anchorage. Jan, what did the Attorney General have to say?
He said he was surprised when the special counsel told him that he was not going to be making a decision on whether or not the president committed the crime of obstruction of justice. He said that he couldn't exonerate the president. You looked at that evidence, and you did. I mean, what's the fundamental difference between your view and his?
Well, I think Bob said that he was not going to engage in the analysis. He was not going to make a determination one way or the other. We analyzed the law and the facts, and a group of us spent a lot of time doing that.
But they also complained repeatedly in their book that both Rod Rosenstein and Bill Barr refused to say that Russia tried to get Donald Trump elected.
Number one, he did say that we found no conspiracy, no collusion, but he did not say that we found that the Russian government not only had interfered in the election, but it interfered with the purpose of electing Donald Trump. He left off that last piece.
And as we'll see when we get into the John Durham stuff, that's important too.
He also left off that we said in the report that the Trump campaign was, in certain respects, willing and eager to accept that help.
Because that is a critical founding myth, invention, bullshit, lie, that is what John Durham bases his 4-year investigation on.
Even after he left office, Trump stayed in touch with the Russian leader, according to Woodward. He cites an unidentified Trump aide who said the former president had as many as 7 private calls with Putin, even one early this year when Trump was urging Republicans to block additional aid to Ukraine in its fight against Russia. The newly revealed contacts raise additional questions about Trump's relationship with Putin. In the recent presidential debate, Trump twice refused to say who he wanted to prevail in the war with Ukraine.
Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I want the war to stop.
Thanks for listening to Ball of Thread. Expect a new episode about every 2 weeks until the election.
To support this series and get answers to your questions with a bonus Q&A podcast, go to patreon.com/balloffthread. You can join us for as little as $1 a month. We appreciate your sharing this work with anyone who cares about the Constitution, and please consider giving us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts.